You got a double welcome, and that's my first line. Welcome, everyone. My name is Natalie Green, the manager of Los Angeles programs at PEN America. Tonight, I'm so happy to join Stephanie Simons and the New York Times subscriber event series to present Overlooked, Righting the Wrongs of Omission. Overlooked, a series created to write the stories of women and minorities left out of the Times obituary pages, perfectly unites what PEN America and the Times seek to do: advocate, celebrate, and provide a platform for diverse voices and their stories in order to better understand our past, present, and one another. We'll begin with excerpts from 4 of these obituaries. Actor Storm Reid reading about Betty Nesmith Graham, actor and comedian Atsuko Okatsuka reading about Bessie B. Springfield, wine and spirits maker, director, and storyteller Francis Ford Coppola reading about Ava Lovelace, and actor Michele Selene Ang, oh goodness, she'll say it better than me, reading about Emma Gatewood. Michele will be followed by a conversation moderated by Times masthead editor Monica Drake, then reception sponsored by the like-minded liquor endeavor Great Women Spirits. Many thanks to Hollywood Forever, Jay, Stacy, and Ricardo for providing the perfectly haunted setting, as well as the Times subscribers and PEN America members in the audience tonight. Without further ado, Storm.
Good evening, everyone. I am very excited to be here. Thank you, New York Times, for having me, and PEN America. So, Betty Nesmith Graham didn't tell anybody about her first few bottles. She mixed the concoction in her kitchen blender and poured it into nail polish containers, then hid it in her desk to avoid the scrutiny of a disapproving boss. In time, her mix would be in every office desk and supply cabinet around the world. The substance was liquid paper, the correction fluid that relieved secretaries and writers everywhere from the pressure of perfection. Graham was born leading an international business based in Dallas that produced 25 million bottles of liquid paper a year at its peak. She would sell the company for $47.5 million 6 months before she died at 56. But in 1954, Graham was a divorced single mother supporting herself and her son, earning $300 a month as a secretary for a Texas bank. She was a bad typist to boot, and then she was forced to use a new typewriter model with sensitive key triggers and a carbon ribbon instead of one made of fabric. The typos piled up. Graham was also an artist who observed that painters covered up mistakes by not erasing their work, but by painting over them. So she sneaked some fast drying paint into work and concealed her typos with a watercolor brush. It was barely noticeable on page. Soon, other secretaries wanted their own supply, and then she found herself staying up late at night, filling bottles in her kitchen. Betty Claire McMurray was born in Dallas in 1924. As a girl, she was passionate about painting and sculpting. She left school at 17 to become a secretary, and 2 years later, she married her high school sweetheart, Warren Nesmith. When her husband went off to fight in World War II, Betty was pregnant with a son. The son, Michael Nesmith, would find fame as a member of the rock band The Monkees. The marriage ended in divorce in 1946. Graham, the name she took after the subsequent marriage, struggled to make ends meet, taking on side jobs. She would often burst into tears of panic. Michael Nesmith wrote in his autobiography, Infinite Tuesday, an autobiographical riff. Graham's invention of correction fluid gave her a glimpse of a way out of her troubles. Every evening, she returned home from work to tinker with the formula, write letters to potential buyers, and send samples. During that time, I often became discouraged, she told the magazine Texas Women in 1977. I wanted the product to be absolutely perfect before I distributed, but it seemed to take so long before that happened. Her first employees were her teenage son and his friends. For $1 an hour, they worked out of her garage filling bottles, applying labels by hand, and cutting the tips of brushes at an angle. Her product began to catch on, and she was written about in a magazine and had a meeting at IBM and received a large order from General Electric. Each new breakthrough required more employees and more space. She moved her operation from her kitchen to a trailer, then to a 4-room house, finally to a shiny new headquarters in downtown Dallas. In 1968, she opened up an automated plant. Her product eventually spawned competitors like Whiteout. Betty Graham was now wealthy with fabulous jewelry and a Rolls Royce. But her wealth came with setbacks. In 1962, she married a frozen food salesman, Robert Graham, who took an active role in the company. They then divorced in 1975. He maneuvered to have the company bar her. To add insult to injury, he tried to change the formula for liquid paper, thus removing her rights to royalties. Graham managed to wrest back control of the company and engineer its sales to Gillette, in a deal that restored her royalties. She then died on May 12, 1980, of complications of a stroke. Most men are ignorant. They don't really understand, she said, in an interview with the Business Archives Project in 1977. And so, women have to just keep on with their determination and be relentless. We have to not relent. Thank you.
Somewhere between myth, memory, and motorcycles, Bessie B. Stringfield was great. In the 1950s, when women were relegated to housework, Stringfield was married several times and revved and roared through Florida's palm tree-lined streets on her Harley Davidson, earning the unofficial title of Motorcycle Queen of Miami. Her legend warranted an induction into the Hall of Fame of the American Motorcyclists Association. Every year, hundreds of women motorcyclists make a cross-country trek in her honor. She has been memorialized in a comic book and mentioned in a documentary. A masterful storyteller, Stringfield amazed people with her accounts of being chased off the road as she traveled through the Jim Crow South, performing stunts on the Wall of Death at carnivals, and serving as a civilian motorcycle dispatch rider for the U.S. Army in the 1940s. Her childhood, in her telling, was Dickensian. Born in Jamaica to an interracial couple, left motherless at a young age, abandoned by her father on a Boston street, and adopted by a benevolent Irish Catholic woman who gave her a motorcycle when she was 16. But from a nursing home in Baltimore, her niece, Esther Bennett, 86, had a different version. She lied. Her mother's name was Maggie Cherry. Her father was James White. They were both Black American and lived in Edenton, North Carolina, according to Bennett. Records confirmed her account. I don't know anything about Jamaican. She was never adopted, Bennett said. She did not know how Bessie Beatrice White Stringfield, a small town southerner, came to be Bessie B. Stringfield, big city Jamaican. In Stringfield's tales, she always came out on top by proving herself or by finding common ground. She told people that she won over a white Miami police officer by demonstrating her riding skills. She told people that she was followed through back roads by an angry white mob, yet she outran them and then found a kind white gas station owner who allowed her to fill up her tank for free. There was also a folklore that she worked for the FBI. The stories were outrageous enough to ring true. Only Stringfield knew if they really were. Anne Farrar, who is working on a memoir of her friendship with Stringfield, passed on some of the misinformation, wanting to keep the legacy alive. Asked about these untruths, Farrar wrote in an email, "Bessie's running from her early past does not discount or in any way lessen her unusual achievements as an adult. And that is why Bessie continues to inspire new generations, and rightfully so. Her lasting power was in her presence, especially in the eyes of children, during a period when seeing a black woman commanding a Harley-Davidson was unprecedented. She would stand up on that bike with one foot on the seat and one foot on the handlebars," her nephew David Skinner said while laughing. She finally settled down in Miami, first working as a domestic and later becoming a certified nursing assistant. She befriended the families that employed her, making an outsized impression on Robert Scott Thomas and Tom Thomas, who were in elementary school in the early 1950s. Their mother, delayed or forgetful, failed to pick them up from school one day, so Stringfield came to the rescue. "We found Bessie out there on her Harley and in her leather jacket," said Tom Thomas, now 70. "Both jumped on the motorcycle with her. I was just a little kid, so I was only wrapped around half of her," Robert Scott Thomas said. "I could feel the heat from the exhaust on my leg." Bea Hines, a columnist at the Miami Herald, wrote a profile of Stringfield in 1981. She made for a colorful interview, sharing her feats and her presence and her preference, for men many years her junior. She claimed to have married 6 of them. Hines also had a personal connection, remembering how Stringfield would lead a pack of motorcyclists, all men, in an annual parade. I can remember being in awe of this beautiful black woman with this big bushy hair under her helmet," she said. Thank you.
Good evening. When I was younger, I came across a thin volume called 12 Against the Gods by William Bolitho. It was a book of a number of short biographies of men throughout history who had defied the odds. There were people like Gandhi and the Prophet Muhammad and Cagliostro and Catiline. And as I was reading it, I thought, well, what about the 12 women throughout history who defied all the odds and under a penalty of not being able to have access to books or to pursue professions that were deemed not appropriate for someone who was meant to marry an important man. And of these women that I selected in my mind, one was Ada Lovelace. She was the only legitimate child of Lady Wentworth and Lord Byron, the poet. Byron, of course, was a very controversial figure, and this was an acrimonious marriage and produced this one child. Byron, interestingly, even her name, Ada, was, I think, derived from Byron's half-sister, Augusta, who was known as Ada, with whom he allegedly had an affair. He was definitely a bad boy, Byron, and if you've ever seen a picture of him, he was very, very handsome. And he, of course, was a poet, and he had a club foot. And interestingly, he was the prototype on that famous summer in Switzerland when Mary Shelley and he and this Dr. Polidori all were going to write horror stories. It was Byron who was the prototype of both Frankenstein, because he was with this club foot and an imposing figure, and also Dracula, which was a character written by Dr. Polidori, who was probably in love with him. And eventually that character became the Dracula of Bram Stoker. So here is a man, the poet, her father, who is in our minds the prototype of both Dracula and Frankenstein, and who was so, the marriage was so controversial, he left, had many other illegitimate child, that the mother raised the daughter in a way, this young girl, to avoid any possible influence or genetic semblance of being at all like her father. So she was funneled into science and scientific books, and she grew to maturity. I think her father died when she was 8. So she grew up with a mother who tried to avoid any knowledge of her father or make sure that no influence of the father could visit her in any way. She grew into a beautiful young eligible lady and was married to the Countess Lovelace. And her interest in science brought her into, and mathematics brought her into great knowledge of many important figures. One of them named Charles Babbage, who had built what was called the analytical engine, which was the first serious mechanical computer. And this was a breakthrough and definitely in our line into the modern computer. It stems back to Babbage, and his sponsor was the Countess Lovelace. But she was more than a sponsor, because she was the one who translated for Babbage all the reportage about his story, one notably from an Italian military engineer whose name I think was Luigi Menabrea, who wrote a series of notes based on these experiments, and it was the Countess Lovelace, Ada, who translated these notes for Babbage. And this book of her notes was really the beginning of computer programming, because she added her own extraordinary mathematical talents in interpreting what this machine could do, and in fact invented the first algorithm. And it's all there documented in the Countess Lovelace notes, and was handed down, and ultimately is part of the ultimate string of computer science leading to the great Alan Turing during the war, who was picked up from Babbage and his collaborator Ada Lovelace, and as the I can't say father of, but the mother of computer programming and of the algorithm, to Alan Turing and his extraordinary contribution to the modern computer. So I figured that there were many other women in that position of not being allowed access to books, or not being allowed to go into certain fields as were considered not ladylike. But because of Ada Lovelace, or Ada Lovelace, and her extraordinary contribution, we have the modern computer and the modern algorithm.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Michele, and I'm very pleased to be here with you all. This story is for Emma Grandma Gatewood. What the public knew about Emma Gatewood was already remarkable. She was the first woman to hike the entire Appalachian Trail by herself in one season. She was 67 years old, a mother of 11, a grandmother, and even a great-grandmother when she accomplished the feat in 1955. But what the public did not know was equally remarkable. Grandma Gatewood, as she was called, had survived 30 years of severe beatings and sexual abuse by her husband. She often escaped from him by running into the woods, and she came to view the wilderness as protective and restorative. Word of her trek on the Appalachian Trail spread from town to town along the 2,050-mile route, from Georgia to Maine. That Gatewood was alone in her late 60s renewed interest in the trail, especially among women. If a woman of her age could hike it all the way, many of them reasoned, they could too. By the time Gatewood died at 85 in 1973, apparently of a heart attack, she had hiked the length of the Appalachian Trail 3 times, and was the first person, man or woman, to conquer it more than once. The story of Gatewood's battering at the hands of her husband did not emerge for more than a half-century. When a newspaper reporter, Ben Montgomery, told her story in Grandma Gatewood's Walk, a book published in 2014. Montgomery worked for the Tampa Bay Times in Florida, and Gatewood was his great-great-aunt. In journals, letters, and scrapbooks, he found stark references to what she had withheld from news interviewers, that her husband had nearly pummeled her to death several times. During one beating, he broke a broom over her head. Her husband's sexual hunger had been insatiable, and he forced himself on her several times a day. In 1937, she left him and moved in with relatives in California, leaving behind 2 daughters, ages 9 and 11. In a sorrowful letter with no return address, she wrote, "I have suffered enough at his hands to last me for the next 100 years." But she returned after a few months, unable to bear being away from them. At that point, her husband would not let her out of his sight. She later wrote that he beat her beyond recognition 10 times. For a lot of people, the trail is a refuge, said Brian B. King, a publisher of guidebooks for the Appalachian Trail Conservancy. But seldom is it a refuge for something as bad as that. Emma Rowena Caldwell was born in 1887 in Gallia County, Ohio. Her father, a farmer who had lost a leg in the Civil War, turned to a life of drinking and gambling. Her mother raised their 15 children, who slept 4 to a bed in the family's log cabin. At 19, Emma married Perry Clayton Gatewood, a teacher who later became a farmer. Almost immediately, he put her to work building fences, burning tobacco beds, and mixing cement, in addition to her household chores. 3 months after their wedding, he started to beat her, a practice he continued until one day he broke her teeth, cracked one of her ribs, and bloodied her face. That day, Gatewood responded by throwing a sack of flour at him, prompting a law enforcement officer to arrest her, not him. The next day, the mayor saw her battered face and took her to his own home, where she remained under his protection until she got back on her feet. A short time later, her husband left for good. Gatewood filed for divorce, and he was out of her life. In 1949, she came across a National Geographic magazine article about the Appalachian Trail and became intrigued to learn that no woman had ever hiked it solo. Gatewood's only real training for her historic trek was walking 10 miles a day to build up her leg muscles. But in a sense, her entire life had prepared her for the undertaking. Through endless farm chores, she knew how to work herself to the bone and then to keep on going. Through her formal education, though her formal education ended in the 8th grade, she was resourceful and taught herself about wildlife and the medicinal properties of plants and which ones were edible. Her first attempt at hiking the Appalachian Trail in 1954 ended badly. Starting out in Maine, she quickly broke her glasses, got lost, and was rescued by rangers who told her to go home. The next year, she started in Georgia and successfully trekked north. In neither instance did she tell her children where she was going, because she feared that they would try to stop her. Gatewood sewed herself a small drawstring sack. In it, she carried as few items as possible, including a shower curtain to keep the rain off, a Swiss Army knife, a flashlight, Band-Aids, iodine, a pen, and a small notebook. Her larder consisted of Vienna sausages, raisins, peanuts, and bouillon cubes. She wore through 7 pairs of canvas shoes, many of them Keds. She had seen no need to lug a tent. She had planned to rely on the hospitality of strangers, and more often than might be expected, she was able to do just that, in part because of her growing fame. Still, she spent many nights on the cold ground, under picnic tables, and even on a porch swing. She completed her first hike in 146 days, an average of 14 miles a day. It was considered a remarkable pace, especially given her age, her limited gear, and the condition of the trail. She would often set out before sunrise and not stop until she was spent. The members of at least one Boy Scout troop and their leaders reported that they could not keep up with her. As she closed in on Mount Katahdin, the northern terminus of the trail in a rugged part of Maine, newspaper reporters extolled her achievement, and much of America was pulling for her, Montgomery wrote. People, he said, were clipping newspaper articles at kitchen tables and watching her traipse across the evening news on television, wondering whether she'd survive, this woman, in so mean a place. Little did they know what she had already survived. Thank you.
Hi, good evening, everyone. We're going to continue the evening by talking to these storytellers who in different ways focus on the stories of overlooked women. Lidia Yuknavitch is an acclaimed writer of many successful works. My own personal favorite is the Book of Joan. And she's also probably equally successful in producing viral videos. She did a TED Talk on misfits, who are always overlooked. Nikita Stewart is a reporter on the Metro desk of the New York Times. She also has contributed, in addition to the piece about Bessie Stringfield, has also contributed to the Overlooked series. And Amy Padnani on the end is the creator of Overlooked. I feel like I literally watched, yeah, just like a moment for that. She's an editor on the obituary desk at the New York Times, and so had read obituaries for years and had a few ideas of what should be included. So I kind of wanted to start with you, Amy. You know, the New York Times is known for its obituaries. We've done it the same way for years and years and years. A lot of people would look at them and say, they're not broken, they're what the Times is known for, and what made you decide to start Overlooked?
Thanks so much, everyone, for coming. This is really exciting to see it come to life and see reactions and how much people appreciate it. So, though I had been at the New York Times for about 6 years when I joined the obituaries desk, I had only been on obits for about 2 months. This was January of 2017. The national debate about race was at a rolling boil, and the conversation about gender inequality was once again taking hold. And at the same time, I was thinking, you know, what could I do as far as diversity as a journalist to improve our report? And I saw that we were getting these emails from some readers saying, hey, why don't you have more women and people of color in your pages? And I thought, yeah, why don't we? It's, you know, a sea of white men. And so I asked my boss, the head of obituaries, and he said, well, obituaries are a rear view look at society at a time when women and people of color were not really invited to the table to make a difference. So as we see people whose heydays were in the 70s die, then we'll have probably more of a balance. But I thought this is, you know, there's still something more we could do. Maybe look at international figures. There's, you know, just find more creative ways to find dead women. So I started working with our research desk to improve our process going forward. And in my day-to-day research for an obituary, I came across a website talking about Mary Outerbridge. She was credited with introducing tennis to America in 1874. And I thought, how neat is that? One of the biggest sports in America, introduced by a woman. And so I checked, as a hunch, I checked our archives. It's called Times Machine. It's a digital archive of every newspaper since 1851 when we started publishing. And I checked to see if she got an obituary. Spoiler alert, she did not. So I started keeping a list anytime I came across other interesting people who weren't in Times Machine. And I began telling some of my colleagues about this, and they said, oh, this is interesting. Did this person get an obit? Did that person get an obit? And soon I had this list of several dozen names. And then I talked to Monica about it, and I said, I think there's something here. I think maybe we could do a series looking all the way back to 1851 when we started publishing to see who else we missed. And so that's sort of how it came about. We found some really surprising names. There was the poet Sylvia Plath. There was the brilliant photographer Diane Arbus, Ida B. Wells, the journalist. So, you know, we thought this was the right time to tell their stories.
So this grew from a really, you know, fastidiously maintained Google Sheet and into kind of a signature series for the Times. What are some of the stories that have resonated that were sort of surprising to you? Are there other notable figures that you thought maybe everybody had known about? Can you think of, besides the people we've just heard about now?
Sure. So I wasn't too surprised. I kind of suspected that when we did the obits for Sylvia Plath and Ida B. Wells, that people would appreciate them and they would appreciate that the paper of record is correcting the record. But it was the stories of kind of more average, everyday women who I think really stood out the most and got the most reaction and feedback. The story about Grandma Gatewood that you heard, she was just a typical woman who did something amazing and didn't, even rub it in. And then there was Allison Hargreaves. She was a mountain climber who was often criticized in her lifetime for leaving her 2 young children behind while she went mountain climbing. Now both her kids climb mountains. And yeah, it was those kinds of stories that really stood out, just everyday women doing great things.
The next question is for Nikita, who has written a few of these. I just want you to talk a little bit about the experience of, exhuming history. This must be challenging. The Times didn't cover these women to begin with, and not a lot of people did. So can you talk a little bit about the process of exhuming lost stories?
Sure. So I wrote the story about Bessie Stringfield, and Amy sent me an email saying, "Oh, I'm doing this. Would you be interested in writing one?" I was like, "Yes, sign me up." And so then she's like, "I want you to do Bessie Stringfield." And I was like, "Who is she?" And so actually there was a lot on the internet about her, and I was like, "Oh my gosh, it's going to be easy." My background is in investigative reporting, but I was like, "Ooh, I get to do a feature. This is going to be good." And then, you start digging, and you're like, "Oh my gosh, a lot of this information is wrong. It's just not true." If there's one thing I think readers, but all of you are like educated readers, is that researchers are so important. And so we have some great researchers at the Times. And Susan Beachy, she helped me look through census records, and we pieced together her early life. And then I found her relatives, like living in Baltimore and at a nursing home, and they told me all these stories of her being estranged. And so the challenge with these obituaries comes with a lot of people are gone who can tell you about them. So I found that to be the most difficult part.
Lidia, you have this talk on misfits, and your characters are often outcast. And I like to think that if there were, a New York Times in the fictional universe that you write about, we probably would exclude people who are some of your central characters. How do you think that we can better incorporate people like that in the stories that we tell now? And so that's one part of the question. And the second part is sort of being on the margins. Does that make, these people and these lives inherently kind of more interesting and richer?
I'm so happy to be here. Can I just say that out loud with these amazing women and men and everyone in the room? So to the first part of your question, here's the thing about dead women, which is that they were all carrying stories in their bodies. Their life stories were in their bodies, and that the culture did not ask them for those stories, nor were those stories represented in very many ways. The recovery of those stories always makes me want to ask the question, what in the hell do we mean when we use the word history? If half the population has been left out of that research, of that storytelling motion, of that way to narrate who we are as people in the world, how can we even use that word? So even tonight when I was listening to the different stories, it threw history back out for me as a question mark, a giant question mark. And so that's a piece of it for me. How dare we use that word until we get better at representing the stories that have been left out of who we are as a people. As to the marginality of women, people of color, LGBTQ people, a whole bunch of different disenfranchised populations, Native peoples, the margins, this is a thing, I don't know why we don't talk about this more, but the margins of any culture, of any populace, of any organism are the place where shape is formed. So there can be no center, there can be no majority, there can be no power, there can be no, main story unless there are populations and experiences and bodies and voices occupying the margins, making it some shape across time. And so this idea that you can recover stories that have been erased or repressed or oppressed or left out, and bodies, Jesus, this gay woman like marching her truths, up against what happened to her. This recovery effort might be the one place we can still locate hope in the face of a cultural moment where the mono story seems to have overtaken everything. And so this is why I think, and we were talking about this earlier, storytelling is in and of itself, in any media, in any form, a radical act. And which is why I'm so excited to be here with you guys.
That was pretty deep. I just had a moment there. Kind of when you talk about the challenge of history, journalists are charged with telling the story of today. So we don't even try to tell history. We try to tell the story of this moment, which is always going to be inexact. But how do you think? I think all of us on the stage and everyone here, I'm sure, sees the value in sort of shedding light on the margins. Not everyone does. So what do you think is a way of sort of evangelizing for telling a fuller story about life and society? This is a question for all of you. Yeah.
Well, in my everyday journalism, I cover social services, poverty, homelessness, child welfare, abuse, and what I try to do in just my everyday reporting is to, one, talk to people who look like me and talk to people who don't look like me. And I'm not so sure every journalist, especially back in the day, did that. And I think that is what shaped a lot of our history. And if I could go so far as to say white history. And so I believe because I really do believe that Amy, this is a movement. And I'm just so honored to I was like, oh my gosh, Amy asked me to do this. This is so great. And just to see how people have responded and that the Times would acknowledge that, the gray lady sometimes makes mistakes. And, we're going to make this right. So it's a wonderful thing.
Well, really, I can speak for obituaries going forward. This retrospective project is fantastic and all, but what are we going to do to change things going forward? And so, I'm there every day in our morning meetings going over our list of dead people, trying to figure out who we should do obits on. And whenever there's a woman there, I really say we have to dig a little deeper, do a little more research, not just skim the surface of Google and news clippings, but try to find a story about this person's life to make sure they aren't worth an obit if we're not going to do an obit, for instance. So sometimes it's obvious. Recently we had an obit for the woman who was credited with inventing sock puppets. So, but sometimes it's really not. There are some community activists, and okay, do they change anyone's life, or do they do something that then became a national movement? You really have to look, especially when it's far in the past, as we discussed earlier. So just try not to be dismissive of those people.
I would just add to those amazing ideas that I mostly work in the world in populations that other people like to pretend are part of the problem. I work with drug rehab people. I work at community colleges where a lot of the population of people who show up have just recently been released from jail, or they're single mothers, or they're living in their cars or trying to go to school. And those populations of people, at the heart of their existence is this idea that their story could matter even if they didn't do something celebrity famous. And so if there's something to evangelize, it's this piece called storytelling. Because I also teach in places that are considered rural and extremely white and extremely underneath or touching the poverty line. And people you would think would have radical resistance to very liberal ideas or progressive ideas, and they do. Not gonna lie. But when you get people to sit down and share the stories of their lives, well, 9 people in the room had abortions with their different religions and their different incomes and their different family members and their different ways of being. Or 9 people in the room experienced sexual abuse. And it's the storytelling act that makes a nexus where we can even hear each other and see each other. And no, we can't solve the world's problems, but there's that moment of, space of storytelling and telling the story of death. Death stories are part of how we stay connected to one another, and especially during a time where every force is coming at us trying to divide us into camps of people who hate each other.
This is about reaching into the past. And do you think that now we're kind of more comfortable about being assertive in re-examining our past than we are in sort of challenging our perception of our present? And how so?
Yes.
Yeah, definitely. And I do feel, especially with some of the recent movements like Me Too and the national debate on race, that collectively our voices are getting stronger in challenging the present as well, which I'm really uplifted by. So, yeah, and I think a lot more people are willing to review the past and embrace it, even those who may have been blamed for perpetuating it, just because they can feel the sort of meaning behind the movement. So I do, yeah.
But there is resistance, and we can see it every day. So,
Can you talk about that a little more?
No. I am a New York Times reporter, and I am unbiased, and I just watch what happens and I document it. But no, there is this resistance to, folks are defending themselves on Reddit every day, and saying, "Why are you blaming me?" And it's one of those things where it's like, it's not personal. And I'm hoping we get through this period of time in not only our country, but the world. That's all I have to say about that. I know Lydia's going to say something profound that'll wrap this up.
I so wish that's something awesome.
No pressure at all.
I don't know what to say. Except a piece that it's not exactly hopeful, but it's apparent. Is this? So yes, I really do think we are in a time where looking back on what we've done so badly is coming loose, and more voices and more bodies and more experiences are sifting to the surface. It's also engendered this massive repressive, oppressive force coming down, shockingly, because that's never happened before. And all I wanted to say was that those two things in tension almost always create fissures and cracks and plate tectonics. And there's still a chance there when things are moving, when the ground is moving, even when it looks like, doom has emerged and the Sith Lords have taken over. If the plate tectonics are indeed happening, it means the ground is still shifting, and so those fissures aren't nothing. That's all I got.
I knew it. Hindsight is always 20/20. We have the benefit of being able to look at life now, see who and what we missed. We may not have realized Ada Lovelace's significance, for example, because we didn't know there would be such a thing as computers, right, that would change our lives, among the other reasons that we overlooked her. What do you think we might be missing now? And if we, relaunch Overlooked in 2070, what's it going to look like? And what themes will it, what themes will it cover, sort of?
I'm not too sure. I struggle with this as an obituaries editor. For instance, if Justin Timberlake went into a cabin in the woods for the next 80 years and then died, would an obituaries editor know his fame in his day? It's really tough to say.
JT, sure.
It's really hard to know what we could be missing. I think it's just important to be open. Maybe you have a better answer.
I don't know if I don't have a better answer, but I do wonder about this Instagram fame time period and whether any of that will matter when you die. Does the Instagram, the menswear dog was in the newsroom, right? And everybody went crazy. It's a dog who wears suits. And he was cute. He was adorable. And then I'm like, so if he dies, does he get an obituary because he has 300,000 followers? These are things that don't keep me up at night, but that I just thought of just now.
I'm for that. I'm for that.
I think I'm going to say right now that the what is he,
The
The menswear, I'm going to say he's not going to get an obituary now or in 80 years. Unless there's something about him we don't know. Those are all of my questions for you guys. Thanks for playing along. We're going to have some questions from the audience. I don't know if there will be. There we go.
Hi, thank you so much for that wonderful discussion and for the readings. I have a question and also, I guess, a comment. And the comment goes back to your earlier question about, the remarkable life, the life that is worthy of being recorded. And I wonder if there are any plans, not to have the great women that did these so-called remarkable things, and how that might fall back into the rhetoric of patriarchy, the individual, the one and only, the great, or women who, do everyday things, so to speak, who have rich lives. And I'm just curious if those stories are going to be told. And then that's kind of a comment. And then my question is, what are the limits of capturing these stories and knowing that there's so much power in structuring a narrative? And, what kind of information do you take? What do you remove? Is there any awareness of your own power and then narrating this story? I'm just curious to hear about that as well. But thank you very much for sharing tonight.
Oh, me? Okay. This isn't about obituaries because I'm not on the obits desk, but in my everyday, I write about folks who are, you pass on the street every day and you don't know what they're going through. And so when I took on the beat of social services in New York City, there were all these stories about, disheveled men standing on the street, and their stories are, valuable, and I believe everybody has a story to tell, but that's because I'm a writer. But I knew that the majority of folks who were in shelter in New York City were women of color, black women specifically, who were like around my age. And so I decided that I had the power to tell that story. And so many of my stories are about the women and children who are struggling with homelessness right now in New York City. So in that, I think I used my power, and I knew I had that power.
This next question is from the right side of the room. Stage right.
Hey, I really enjoyed the conversation tonight. Thank you very much. I used to work at a educational publishing company in New York, and we had to prepare encyclopedia entries for people who were going to die. We had to do this in advance. And so I'm wondering if that's a similar process you guys have. I know a colleague of yours at the New York Times who had to come with a video camera to someone's apartment, knocked on his door, and the guy, I guess, didn't realize what was happening and thought it was just like an interview, and and he had to be like, okay, so this is for your obituary. And the guy had to stop and say, like, oh, give me just a minute. So I'm wondering, on your side, preparing these obituaries for who's going to be out there. Well, we know who's going to die, right? And so how do you decide in advance who to cover?
Yeah, we call them advance obituaries. We have a database of a couple thousand of them for people who have not yet died. Generally, if they're really old, like if they're in their mid-80s or older, if they're in their 70s, they're still spring chickens, so we leave that alone. They're going to keep doing things in their lives, and it becomes very difficult when you have to keep updating their advance obit. We do have them, though, for really famous people, all those surviving presidents, in case anything happens. And otherwise, if they're really sick, that's another reason to get their advance obit ready. The process is interesting. I've seen different writers handle it differently. Some prefer to just do strictly research. Some of them prefer to contact the subjects who's still alive. And in one instance, I overheard one of our senior obituary writers, Marguerite Fox, on the phone with the woman who invented the poodle skirt, who has not yet died, but I think she's 99 or something like that. And she was asking her, I'm calling from the New York Times, and I'm collecting some biographical information. Can we go over some things? And then she began asking these specific questions, and what kind of scissors were you using to cut the fabric? And so you were going to a party. Is that what it was? And finally, the woman was suspicious, and she said, yes, I'm writing your advanced obituary. And the woman handled it really well, and they continued the conversation for a really long time. So it differs, I think. Some subjects are more offended and will slam the door in your face. Some are like, oh, good, I get a say. That's great. So it really varies.
This next question is from the back row on the right.
I really want actually to open this up for everyone too, but when you talked about the tectonic platelets, that right now we're living in a world where, according to the World Health Organization, 1 out of 3 women in any country is going to be raped or brutalized. And we have a really intense moment where women themselves are able to step out, and yet the most extreme forms in every country, especially of fundamentalism, if it's Islamic fundamentalism, Hindu fundamentalism, in this country right now, we have Christian fascist fundamentalism in the White House. We have a world, and I just want to ask one question, which is, I'm with the Bob Avakian Institute, and he talks about the need to uproot the entire system of masters and slaves, that until we do that, we'll never get rid of this form of oppression. I want to talk about solutions of actually overturning the system and getting to a radically different world, and I think we got to sit and talk about that. Because I don't want to hear any more stories. We've heard so many stories, Me Too, you hear so many stories. We've got to end this and actually end the system through revolution.
Well, I just would say that, stories often are what inspire people to make decisions about the world and the actions that they want to take to kind of create the world that they want to see. So stories aren't worthless.
Miriam.
I'm the national immigration correspondent at the New York Times, and the power of stories cannot be, overestimated. It's unbelievable. I mean, I have been writing about family separations for several months now, and I am committed to writing more and more about this, because with every story, there are several readers who step forward and want to do something to change the world. And there are a group of professional women in New York who read one of my first stories about a little boy who was separated from his father at the border, and all he had when he landed in Michigan, having been separated from his dad in Texas, were these 2 drawings, sketch drawings of his family, which he would not let go of. And the outpouring that created, and the actual formation of a group of professional women in New York who have now become dedicated to helping families that were separated, that are being put together again. We don't express our opinions. We can't advocate for causes, but I think that the power of the stories, to not tell stories, I'm sorry, that's just, it's impossible. It's, you know, so that's all I wanted to.
We have time for one more question.
Hi. It might be a little premature at this time, but are there any plans to do a compilation of these stories, of these obituaries into a book?
Well, right now it's going to become a TV show. So, yeah, it's some sort of like an anthology. It's still being figured out. After that, yeah, there's some talk of putting it together in a book, but we haven't really gotten that far yet. Thanks.